The vast, inky blackness of space stretched out before the forward glaive, a sleek human scout cruiser that glided effortlessly through the void. Captain Dan stood on the bridge, his weathered features etched with a calm determination as he surveyed the endless sea of stars. "All systems nominal, sir," reported Lieutenant Jensen, his voice betraying a hint of unease. "We're holding position as ordered." Dan nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "Good. Maintain alert status. Something doesn't feel right about this sector." The crew of the forward glaive was on edge. They had been dispatched to this remote backwater region to prepare the way for the incoming colony ships, a routine assignment that should have been uneventful. But the air was thick with a sense of foreboding, as if unseen eyes were watching their every move. Suddenly, a flash of light caught Dan's eye, and his heart sank as an unfamiliar vessel emerged from the darkness. It was a sleek, angular craft, its crimson surface glinting with an ominous intensity. "Unidentified vessel, this is the forward glaive of the Imperial human colonies," Dan said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "Identify yourself and state your purpose in this sector." Silence hung heavy in the air, punctuated only by the faint hum of the ship's systems. Then, a crackling voice emerged from the comms, dripping with sarcasm. "You call that thing a ship? God, was this happening?" The alien captain let out a derisive laugh. "Identify yourself, human." Dan tightened his grip on the railing, his crew staring at him with a mix of fear and uncertainty. "I am Captain Dan of the forward glaive. This is human territory, and we are under orders of the Imperial Navy to be here." The alien's response was laced with disdain. "That's the stupidest thing I've ever seen. No one was supposed to be here. HQ had this all figured out. You're just a backwater assignment." A pause, then a chilling realization. "Oh God, what has it become now?" Dan felt a chill run down his spine. "This is Scout Cruiser Forward Glaive of the Imperial human colonies. We are under orders to be here." The alien captain's voice took on a mocking tone. "Ha, look at that energy output. It's laughable, laughable." Dan's crew shifted nervously, their faces etched with growing concern. The captain turned to the shield technician, his eyes narrowed in a steely gaze. "Don't fuck this up, kid," he growled, before turning his attention back to the alien vessel. "I am ordering you to identify yourself." The line went silent, save for the sound of shuffling and muffled laughter. Then the alien captain's voice returned, dripping with venom. "Let me make something clear to you, forward glaive. You come from civilization, from lands of control, but you're in the back sectors now. You're in the fucking pits of the universe." Dan's heart sank as the alien ship came into view, a sleek, crimson blade of terror that seemed to loom ever closer. The captain's words echoed in his mind, a chilling reminder of their precarious situation. In the land of the lawless, there are no orders, no commands. There is only God, and God is an ungrateful, violent fucker. God is only concerned with you when you die. God is death. Dan swallowed hard, his bravado slipping as the realization of their predicament sank in. These were no mere pirates. They were the Nikari, the most ruthless and despicable alien brigands in the galaxy. "And guess what?" the Nikari captain continued, his voice dripping with malice. "If God is death, then that makes us her angels. And your commands are nothing to God. You are nothing to God. You are nothing to us." Dan's vision blurred as he struggled to maintain his composure. "Listen, no talking now. You know the deal. Give up the ship, and we'll allow a few of you to live as slaves. If not, death will not welcome you, but she will embrace all." Dan's jaw tightened, a spark of defiance flickering in his eyes. "That's not happening." He turned to his crew, his voice rasping with determination. "Jensen, all cannons aim and fire. I want hell on that awful red ship. Perry, keep the engines hot, and make sure we're on our toes. I don't want a single projectile hitting us while our thrusters are still working." The bridge erupted into a frenzy of activity, the air thick with the sound of scurrying feet and barked orders. Dan gripped the railing, his knuckles turning white as he watched the enemy vessel draw closer. The Nikari captain's voice returned, dripping with sarcastic resignation. It was an honorable attempt, but it is we, the living, who invented honor. God has no place nor want for it. In the end, we care not if you scrap or slave in these final moments. Tell your gods of how they've betrayed you, and prepare to meet the only divine who ever really tried to speak with you, death. Dan's crew fought with desperation, their weapons blazing against the crimson behemoth. But it was clear they were outmatched, their defenses crumbling under the onslaught. As the pirate ship closed in, Dan steeled himself for the inevitable. "Perry, can we escape?" "Not even close, Captain," she replied, her voice laced with fear. "They'll be in range in seconds. Our shields have been disabled." Dan spun around, his eyes wide with alarm. "Disabled? Why are they disabled?" I don't know," Perry stammered, her brow glistening with sweat. Dan took a deep breath, his mind racing. "All right. Well, hell, then we're just going to go for it." "Perry, full forward." The ship lurched forward, barreling towards the crimson behemoth as the first salvos of projectiles flew. Dan braced himself, his eyes fixed on the approaching vessel. Jensen, all guns faced portside and ready to fire. He yelled, his voice hoarse with desperation. The ship rocked violently as the pirates' weapons found their mark, alarms blaring and smoke billowing into the bridge. Dan fought to keep his footing, his heart pounding in his ears. "Captain, we've taken heavy damage," Jensen shouted. "I don't know how much longer we can hold out." Dan felt a sinking sensation in the pit of his stomach. This was it, the end, but he refused to go down without a fight. Gripping the railing, he turned to his crew, his eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and fierce determination. "Listen up, you bastards," he bellowed. "We're going to give those pirates hell. We're going to show them what humanity is made of. Who's with me?" The crew, battered and bruised, met his gaze with a renewed sense of purpose. Dan nodded, a faint glimmer of hope flickering in his heart. "Then let's do this," he said, his voice unwavering. "For the colony ships, for our families, and for humanity." As the two ships closed in on each other, Dan steeled himself for the final desperate clash. The fate of countless lives hung in the balance, and he was determined to ensure humanity's triumph, no matter the cost. Crash landing and survival. The forward glaive lurched and shuddered as the pirate ship's relentless barrage rained down upon it. Alarms blared, and the bridge shook with the force of each impact. Dan clung to the railing, his eyes narrowed in determination. "Perry, get us out of here," he yelled, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of sounds. "Captain, the engines are failing," Perry shouted back, her fingers flying across the control panels. "We're losing power fast." Dan gritted his teeth, the realization dawning on him that their only hope of escape was slipping away. He scanned the horizon, desperate for any sign of salvation, when a glimmer of hope appeared in the distance, a desolate-looking planet. "There," he pointed, his voice tinged with urgency. "Set a course for that planet, maximum thrust. We have to make it, no matter what." The forward glaive groaned and strained as it hurtled towards the planet's atmosphere, its hull buckling under the strain. Dan and his crew braced themselves, praying that their ship would hold together long enough to make a safe landing. With a bone-jarring impact, the forward glaive slammed into the planet's surface, skidding and tumbling across the rocky terrain. Dan was thrown about the bridge, his body battered and bruised, but he refused to let go of the railing. Finally, the ship came to a grinding halt, its engines silent and its lights dimming. Dan took a shaky breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked around the bridge, his gaze sweeping over his injured and terrified crew. "Casualties," he croaked, his voice hoarse from the ordeal. "Jensen, his arm dangling limply at his side, stepped forward. "We've got several critical injuries, Captain. We need to get them medical attention. Fast." Dan nodded, wincing as he pushed himself to his feet. "All right, let's get everyone to the medbay. We need to assess the damage and get this ship back in working order." As the crew tended to their wounded comrades, Dan made his way to the bridge's viewports, gazing out upon the bleak, rocky landscape that surrounded them. His heart sank as he realized the full extent of their predicament. "Jensen," he called out, his voice heavy with resignation. "What's our status?" Jensen joined him at the viewport, his face etched with concern. "It's not good, sir. The forward glaive is in bad shape. We've lost 2 engines, and the hull is badly compromised. I don't think we're going anywhere anytime soon." Dan's jaw tightened, his mind racing with the implications of their situation. "The colony ships," he murmured, his brow furrowing with worry. "They'll be arriving in a matter of months. We have to warn them. Somehow." Jensen's eyes widened with realization. "You're right, Captain. If those pirates find the colony ships, they'll be slaughtered. We have to do something." Dan turned to face his crew, his expression steely with determination. "All right, listen up, everyone. We may be stranded, but we're not beaten. Those colony ships are headed this way, and we're the only ones who know what's waiting for them." The crew gathered around him, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and resolve. Dan took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over them. "We need to get this ship back in working order, and we need to do it fast. Jensen, I want you and the engineering team to prioritize the repairs. Focus on the engines and the communications array. We need to be able to send a warning to those colony ships." Jensen nodded, his expression grim. Aye, Captain. We'll work around the clock if we have to." "Good," Dan said, his voice steady. "The rest of you, we need to secure this area, set up defenses, and gather any supplies we can. Those pirates might come back, and we have to be ready for them." The crew sprang into action, their movements swift and efficient. Dan watched them for a moment, a glimmer of pride shining in his eyes. These were not the trained officers and pilots he had led into battle. These were survivors, forged in the crucible of adversity. As the hours turned to days, the crew of the forward glaive worked tirelessly, their hands calloused and their brows furrowed with concentration. The ship slowly began to take shape, its damaged systems repaired and its weapons refitted. Dan, his own body battered and weary, oversaw the operation, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He knew that time was not on their side. The colony ships would arrive soon, and they had to be ready to face the Nakari threat. One evening, as the crew gathered around a makeshift campfire, Dan approached Jensen, his expression grave. "How are the repairs coming?" he asked, his voice low. Jensen wiped the sweat from his brow, his face etched with exhaustion. "We're making progress, but it's slow going. The damage is extensive, and we're working with limited resources." Dan nodded, his gaze distant. "And the communications array?" "Up and running, but we haven't been able to make contact with the colony ships," Jensen replied, his voice tinged with regret. "The interference in this sector is too strong. We're going to need to find a way to get a message out to them. Somehow." Dan's jaw tightened, his mind racing with the weight of their responsibility. "We have to, Jensen. Those people are walking into a slaughter. We have to find a way to warn them, no matter what." Jensen met his gaze, his eyes reflecting the determination that burned within them all. "We will, Captain. We'll find a way. We won't let those pirates take another life. Not on our watch." Dan nodded, his lips curving into a faint smile. "That's what I like to hear. Now, get back to work. We've got a lot of work to do." As the days turned to weeks, the crew of the forward glaive transformed their makeshift base into a formidable stronghold, fortifying their defenses and stockpiling whatever supplies they could scavenge. Dan, his body still bearing the scars of their crash landing, watched over them with a fierce protectiveness, his mind consumed by a single unwavering goal: to save the incoming colony ships from the Nakari's wrath. The clock was ticking, and the fate of countless lives hung in the balance. But Dan and his crew were determined to rise to the challenge, no matter the cost. They had been spared for a reason, and they would not let that chance go to waste. Forging a weapon of vengeance. The months following their crash landing had been a grueling, relentless struggle, but the battered crew of the forward glaive refused to give up. Driven by a burning desire for vengeance and a steadfast determination to protect the incoming colony ships, they poured their every waking hour into transforming the wreckage of their ship into a formidable weapon of war. Dan stood amidst the chaos of their makeshift workshop, his eyes scanning the patchwork mess of scrap metal, salvaged parts, and hastily fabricated components that would soon become their salvation. With a deep breath, he turned to his crew, his voice ringing out with a newfound sense of purpose. "Listen up, everyone," he called, commanding the attention of the weary but resolute faces that surrounded him. "We all know what's at stake here. Those colony ships are going to be arriving soon, and we're the only ones who can protect them from the Nakari menace." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Dan could see the spark of determination burning in their eyes. "This ship we're building, this is our chance to fight back, to show those damn pirates what humanity is made of. It won't be pretty, and it won't be easy, but I know each and every one of you is up for the challenge." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled crew. "We may have been beaten, battered, and broken, but we're still standing, and we're going to take that fight to the Nakari, and we're going to win." The crew erupted into a chorus of cheers and battle cries, their spirits reinvigorated by Dan's words. The captain couldn't help but allow a faint smile to tug at the corners of his lips. These were no longer the timid, demoralized survivors he had led from the forward glaive. These were warriors, forged in the crucible of adversity, and they were ready to reclaim their destiny. In the days and weeks that followed, the crew worked tirelessly, their hands calloused and their brows beaded with sweat as they transformed the remnants of the forward glaive into a formidable, if unconventional, vessel of war. Scavenged parts were welded and bolted together, creating a patchwork hull that seemed to defy the laws of physics, while hastily fabricated weapons and defenses were installed with a sense of desperate urgency. Dan, his own body aching from the endless hours of toil, oversaw the operation, his keen eyes scrutinizing every detail, every weld, every component. This ship, this product of their collective rage and determination, was the key to their survival, and he would be damned if he allowed a single flaw to compromise its mission. As the project neared completion, Dan gathered his crew around him, his expression grave but resolute. "My friends," he began, his voice low and measured, "we all know what's at stake here. Those colony ships are coming, and they have no idea what's waiting for them. But we do, and we're going to be the ones to protect them." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the sea of faces before him. "I know it hasn't been easy, and I know we've all sacrificed more than we ever thought we could. But this is our chance. This is our destiny." Dan took a deep breath, his chest swelling with a sense of pride and conviction. "We were spared for a reason, my friends. We were spared so that we could fight, so that we could reclaim what was taken from us. And now we're going to do just that." The crew listened in rapt silence, their eyes reflecting the same fierce determination that burned within their captain. "This ship we've built, this is our weapon, our tool of vengeance. It's rough, it's ugly, and it's a far cry from the sleek, pristine vessels we're used to. But it's ours, and it's going to get the job done." Dan's lips curled into a grim smile as he surveyed the patchwork craft, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Those pirates, those Nakari, they think they've won. They think they've broken us, that they've taken everything from us. But they're wrong. We're still here, and we're going to show them exactly what humanity is capable of." The crew erupted into a thunderous cheer, their voices echoing across the desolate landscape. Dan raised his hand, silencing them with a gesture. "Now, listen up. We don't have much time. Those colony ships will be here soon, and we need to be ready. We're going to take this ship, this Devils of Death, as it's been called, and we're going to show those Nikeri bastards exactly what we're made of." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled crew, his expression hardening with resolve. "We're going to protect those innocent lives, no matter the cost. We're going to make those pirates pay for what they've done, and we're going to do it with every ounce of fury and determination that courses through our veins." The crew roared their approval, their voices rising in a thunderous chorus of battle cries and oaths of loyalty. Dan felt a surge of pride swell within his chest, his heart pounding with the realization that they were finally ready to take the fight to their enemies. As the final preparations were made and the Devils of Death took to the skies, Dan stood at the helm, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. He knew that the battles to come would be fierce, that the odds were stacked against them, but he also knew that they had forged something greater than any ship. They had forged a bond of brotherhood, a shared purpose that would carry them through the darkest of times. "For the colony ships," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. "For our families, and for humanity." With a deep breath, he gripped the controls, his fingers steady and his resolve unwavering. The time had come to meet their destiny, to reclaim what was theirs, and to protect the innocent lives that depended on them. As the Devils of Death streaked across the void, Dan felt a surge of confidence coursing through his veins. They were no longer the broken, demoralized survivors of the forward glaive. They were warriors, forged in the crucible of adversity, and they were ready to face the Nikeri menace head-on. The desperate battle. The patchwork ship known as the Devils of Death hurtled through the void of space, its engines roaring with a determined ferocity. At the helm, Captain Dan gripped the controls, his eyes narrowed with focus as he guided the vessel towards its inevitable confrontation with the Nikeri pirate ship. "Status report," Dan barked, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "We're holding together, Captain," Jensen replied, his face etched with a mixture of apprehension and resolve. "All systems are operational, and the weapons are primed and ready." Dan nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "Good. As soon as we make contact, unleash hell on those bastards. We can't afford to hold anything back." The crew of the Devils of Death braced themselves, their fingers tightening around their stations as the crimson form of the Nikeri vessel came into view. Dan felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins, his muscles tensing in anticipation of the impending clash. "Targets acquired," Jensen reported, his voice terse. "Weapons locked and ready to fire on your command, Captain." Dan took a deep breath, his mind racing with 1,000 different scenarios, each one more dire than the last. "All right, everyone. This is it. Remember, we're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for the lives of those innocent colonists. We can't afford to lose." With a nod, he turned his attention back to the view screen, his fingers poised on the firing controls. Open fire. A barrage of projectiles and energy blasts erupted from the Devils of Death, streaking towards the Nikeri ship in a blinding display of firepower. The pirate vessel, caught off guard by the intensity of the assault, struggled to mount a coherent defense, its weapons firing wildly in a desperate attempt to fend off the onslaught. The two ships traded blows, the air thick with the roar of engines and the shrill whine of tearing metal. Dan gritted his teeth, his eyes narrowed in concentration as he maneuvered the Devils of Death, dodging enemy fire and capitalizing on every opening in the Nikeri's defenses. "Keep it up," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of battle. "We can't let them regroup." The crew responded with a renewed sense of determination, their fingers flying across their stations as they unleashed volley after volley of devastating attacks. The Nikeri ship, battered and increasingly outmatched, began to show signs of strain, its hull crumbling under the relentless onslaught. Dan watched with a grim satisfaction as the enemy vessel's systems began to fail, its once sleek form now a patchwork of scars and scorch marks. But even as the tide of the battle seemed to turn in their favor, he knew that the fight was far from over. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the Devils of Death, sending the crew tumbling to the floor. Dan clung to the controls, his eyes wide with alarm. "Report," he barked, his voice tinged with desperation. "We've taken heavy damage to the starboard engines," Jensen shouted, his face pale with fear. "We're losing power, Captain." Dan's jaw tightened, his mind racing with 1,000 possible contingencies. Reroute power from the forward cannons, and get those engines back online. We can't afford to lose our mobility now. The crew scrambled to comply, their fingers flying across the control panels as they fought to keep the battered ship airborne. But even as they worked, Dan could see the Nakari vessel regrouping, its weapons powering up for a devastating counterattack. "They're charging their main guns," Jensen warned, his voice laced with dread. "Captain, we won't be able to take another hit like that." Dan gripped the controls, his knuckles turning white with the intensity of his grip. "Then we'll have to hit them first," he growled, his eyes narrowing with determination. "All available power to the forward cannons. We're going to put everything we got into one final salvo." The crew responded with a furious intensity, their fingers dancing across the controls as they channeled every last ounce of power into the ship's forward weapons. Dan braced himself, his heart pounding in his chest as the Nakari ship opened fire. The air exploded with the sound of screeching metal and shattering glass, the Devils of Death rocking violently under the impact of the enemy's assault. Dan gritted his teeth, holding on for dear life as he waited for the opportune moment to strike. "Now," he roared, his voice cutting through the chaos like a sharpened blade. The forward cannons erupted in a blinding barrage of firepower, their deadly payload slamming into the Nakari vessel with devastating force. The pirate ship shuddered and groaned, its hull crumbling under the relentless onslaught as Dan and his crew poured every last ounce of their strength into the attack. Slowly, agonizingly, the Nakari ship began to break apart, its once formidable form disintegrating into a cloud of debris and searing plasma. Dan watched, his expression grim but resolute, as the enemy vessel drifted helplessly, its engines silent and its weapons rendered inert. The bridge of the Devils of Death was silent, save for the labored breathing of the exhausted crew. Dan surveyed the scene, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and sorrow. They had won the battle, but at a terrible cost. "Casualties?" he asked, his voice ragged with fatigue. Jensen, his face etched with a sorrowful resignation, shook his head. "Too many, Captain. We've lost half our crew." Dan closed his eyes, his jaw tightening with the weight of their loss. "They won't have died in vain," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "We've done it. We've protected the colony ships." The crew remained silent, their eyes reflecting the same mix of grief and triumph that consumed their captain. They had faced the most daunting challenge of their lives and emerged victorious, but the cost had been high, and the road ahead was still fraught with uncertainty. As the Devils of Death drifted amidst the floating wreckage of the Nakari ship, Dan's gaze drifted towards the distant horizon, where the faint glimmer of the colony ships could be seen making their way towards their new home. "We did it," he whispered, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "We saved them." The crew, their spirits buoyed by their hard-won victory, began to stir, their faces alight with a newfound sense of purpose. They had proven their mettle, forged in the crucible of adversity, and they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As the Devils of Death turned and set a course for the colony ships, Dan felt a surge of pride and determination coursing through his veins. They had done the impossible, and in doing so, they had cemented their place in the annals of human history. "For the fallen," he murmured, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And for the future, humanity's ascent." The battered and scarred form of the Devils of Death drifted amidst the floating wreckage of the vanquished Nakari vessel, its crew battered and bruised but triumphant. Captain Dan stood on the bridge, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, where the faint silhouettes of the colony ships could be seen steadily approaching. The air was thick with a profound sense of relief and sorrow, the crew grappling with the reality of their hard-won victory and the heavy toll it had exacted. Dan's heart ached for the fallen, their names etched forever in the annals of humanity's struggle for survival. As the colony ships drew closer, a wave of activity swept through the Devils of Death, the crew springing into action with a renewed sense of purpose. Dan watched as they prepared to make contact, his mind racing with the implications of what lay ahead. "Hail the colony ships," he commanded, his voice steady despite the tumult of emotions swirling within him. "We have a message that they need to hear." The communications officer's fingers danced across the controls, and moments later, a response crackled to life through the speakers. "This is the colony ship Endeavor. We're receiving your transmission. What's your status?" Dan took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the faces of his battered but resolute crew. "Endeavor, this is Captain Dan of the Devils of Death. We have encountered and engaged a powerful enemy, the Nakari pirate forces. We're in bad shape, but we've managed to cripple their ship. You need to be aware of the threat that awaits you." A stunned silence hung in the air, punctuated only by the hum of the ship's systems. Finally, the response came, laced with a mixture of disbelief and alarm. "Devils of Death, you're saying the Nakari are here? How is that possible? Our intelligence indicated this sector was secure." Dan's jaw tightened, his expression grim. "I'm afraid your intelligence was wrong, Endeavor. The Nakari are here, and they're waiting for you. You need to be prepared for a fight." Another pause, then the voice on the other end came back, its tone resolute. "Understood, Devils of Death. We'll relay your warning to the other colony ships and prepare for battle. Hang in there, we're on our way." Dan nodded, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Roger that, Endeavor. We'll be waiting." As the communication channel closed, Dan turned to his crew, his eyes shining with a mixture of pride and determination. "You heard them, everyone. It's time to get this ship back in fighting shape. We may have won the battle, but the war is far from over." The crew sprang into action, their movements swift and efficient as they began the arduous task of repairing the battered vessel. Dan watched over them, his mind racing with the implications of what lay ahead. In the days that followed, the Devils of Death gradually regained its strength, its systems repaired and its weapons refitted. Dan stood at the helm, his gaze fixed on the distant colony ships as they approached the sector, their crews no doubt bracing themselves for the impending conflict. As the colony ships drew closer, Dan could see the moment when they finally spotted the wreckage of the Nakari vessel, their crews no doubt reeling with the realization of the threat that awaited them. But then, their radios crackled to life, and the voice of Captain Dan echoed across the void. "Colony ships, this is Captain Dan of the Devils of Death. We've engaged and crippled the Nakari pirate vessel, but we're in no shape to offer more than a temporary respite. You need to be prepared for a fight. These bastards won't give up without a hell of a struggle." The colony ships responded with a mixture of awe and gratitude, their crews eager to learn more about the battered but defiant vessel that had stood in the gap to protect them. "Devils of Death, this is the Endeavor. We're moving to secure the area and establish a defensive perimeter. Stand by for further instructions. We're going to need your help to finish this fight." Dan nodded, his eyes narrowing with determination. "Understood, Endeavor. We'll be ready." As the colony ships maneuvered into position, the Devils of Death took its place alongside them, its battered but formidable form a testament to the indomitable spirit of the humans who had forged it. The Nakari, sensing the imminent threat, launched a desperate counterattack, their crimson ships swarming like a horde of angry hornets. But this time, the colony ships were ready, their crews having honed their skills and sharpened their resolve in the face of the impending danger. The battle that followed was fierce and unforgiving, the air thick with the roar of engines and the scream of weapons fire. Dan and his crew fought with a ferocity born of their harrowing experiences, their every action fueled by a burning desire for vengeance and a steadfast commitment to protect the innocent lives that had been entrusted to them. As the battle raged on, the colony ships slowly began to gain the upper hand, their coordinated efforts and superior firepower gradually turning the tide. Dan watched, his heart swelling with pride, as the Nikari ships were one by one reduced to drifting, lifeless hulks. Finally, the last of the pirate vessels fell, its remains drifting lifelessly in the void. A deafening cheer rose up from the colony ships, their crews celebrating their hard-won victory. Dan, his face etched with a weary but triumphant smile, turned to his own crew, his eyes shining with a mixture of pride and gratitude. "You did it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You all did it. Humanity prevailed here today." The crew erupted into a thunderous round of applause, their voices mingling with the triumphant cries of their fellow colonists. Dan stood back, his gaze sweeping across the scene, his heart filled with a profound sense of awe and wonder. In the weeks and months that followed, the colony ships set to work, establishing a thriving settlement on the once desolate world, and at the center of it all stood the Devils of Death, its battered but unyielding form a constant reminder of the sacrifices that had been made to secure their future. A grand statue was erected in honor of Captain Dan and his crew, its imposing form overlooking the bustling colony below. And at the base of the statue, a simple yet powerful message was etched in the stone: "Never give up, and take your fate and make it your destiny." Mankind prevailed here. As the colonists went about their daily lives, they would pause to gaze up at the statue, their eyes reflecting a mixture of reverence and gratitude. For they knew that they owed their very existence to the courage and determination of the crew of the Devils of Death, who had faced the most daunting of challenges and emerged victorious. And so, the legacy of Captain Dan and his crew lived on, their story becoming a symbol of humanity's indomitable spirit and its boundless capacity for triumph in the face of adversity. They had not merely survived, but had risen to become the architects of a new era, one in which the reach of humanity would extend ever further into the vastness of the stars. In the end, the Devils of Death was not just a ship, but a testament to the power of the human spirit, a testament that would continue to inspire generations to come, a shining beacon of hope and courage in the endless expanse of the cosmos.